start. I'm drawing from a presentation that I made a few years back, just because that was a good way to get the pictures that were in order all sent over. I'm not going to be just talking about a history of the lodge, but emphasizing Frieda Fromm-Reichmann and also Harry Stack Sullivan, who didn't have as close an influence on the lodge community as Frieda Fromm-Reichmann did, but he had significant input. So Chestnut Lodge opened in 1910 and closed in 2001. On April 26th, April 27th, which was 44 years to the day, April 27th, after Frieda Fromm-Reichmann's death. It was a kind of interesting coincidence, a date. In its prime, it was the world's beacon for psychodynamic treatment of severe mental illnesses, predominantly schizophrenia. Many on the staff became training analysts. The lodge's gradually demise illustrates forces affecting mental health care throughout the U.S. and the world. I'm not going to give a careful tour of the grounds, but I'll show you a map of the grounds, as they were a few years before the hospital closed. In earlier decades, the Bullards, who were that was the family who owned the lodge, sold off farmlands that had become isolated from the main campus when a large interstate was built, cutting the property in two. And later they donated land to Rockville for a middle school and for a city park. They were pillars of the Rockville community. In 1996, the Bullard family voted to sell the lodge to CPC, Community Psychiatric Clinics. The ambience changed dramatically overnight. We all received memos that read, "To all newly hired employees, welcome to the CPC Health Corporation!" Fingerprinting is essential to the fulfillment of your assignment, unquote. And we were given directions to the local police department so we could all be fingerprinted. In 2000, about 40 acres, including 7 buildings, were sold to developers who demolished the buildings, sawed down the chestnut trees, and filled the area with McMansions, large and expensive homes with little individuality. Okay, next. Chestnut Lodge was located in historic Rockville, a town that began as a resort for Washingtonians escaping mosquito-filled swamps in the summer. Homes such as this one line Montgomery Avenue, where the lodge was. And this one is my favorite, painted in purple, pink, and rose. Built in 1887 as the retirement home of a Marine Corps captain, and hence the porthole window on the right, it hosted the owner's Marine Corps friend, John Philip Sousa, who led his band in concerts given on the front porch. Rockville is the county seat of Montgomery County, one of the richest in the country. Many large, imposing government buildings are downtown, a few blocks from the lodge. National Institutes of Health has a Rockville campus, and so on. And there's a community college, Montgomery College, close by, so that patients who are working towards outpatiency and are interested in continuing their education could take courses at the junior college. There was a metro station close by, and people could ride on into DC for whatever. Next. Okay, this is a picture of the main building as it looked in 1910. It had been built as the Woodlawn Hotel, but the owner of the Woodlawn Hotel went bankrupt before completing the thing. Ernest Bullard, who was the first medical director of the lodge, discovered it in 1908. There's an interesting story about him. He had been working as the superintendent of the Mendota State Hospital in Wisconsin during Robert La Follette Sr.'s tenure as governor. La Follette asked Bullard, he was telling Bullard he'd like to be able to hold political functions on the grounds of the hospital since it had a great view overlooking Lake Mendota. Bullard said this would interfere with patient care, and La Follette told him to look for another job. So he packed up the family and was looking along the East Coast for a place. He focused on Washington because he figured if there ever was a big depression in the country, the federal government would take care of itself first and everyone else second. So it was able to survive the Great Depression when very many of the small hospitals and sanatoria in the country closed. Now there was another factor in that, which was the Flexner Report, which came out in 1911. Flexner, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, had visited every medical school in the country, and he wrote up his report where some were lauded for their great teaching and clinical work, and others were really trashed. I remember one report where he talked about the laboratory was a mess. There were cigar boxes with test tubes lying in them slanty, and the floor was dirty and sticky, etc., etc. So he went right down to, in some medical schools where there was no clinical experience whatsoever in the entire course of training. So that was that spilled over into evaluations of the various sanatoria, and many were forced out of business. Next. This is this is the same building that you saw on the previous slide, but with the porches and other features removed. This is the main building, and I hope that everybody either has read or will read Joanne Greenberg's classic, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. I think that's really the best way into seeing how Frieda Fromm-Reichmann worked. And Joanne had a splendid recovery from a severe psychosis that had begun during her latency years. So she was on the 4th floor, disturbed women's floor. Main 3 was disturbed men. Main 2 was for less disturbed patients. And the 1st floor was like an administrative and admissions area. In the final months before Chestnut Lodge was sold to CPC, this huge oak tree fell. As you can see, it would fall to the left. No one was hurt. There was no one who even saw the fall, but it just seemed like a warning. After the lodge was sold, and then after CPC went bankrupt, there was a fire in the main building that burned it to the ground. We all suspected that CPC had set the fire, but that was never in any way proven. They were trying to sell each floor for $1 million and to renovate those floors. I had a patient on Main 3 whose roommate was in cold wet sheet pack, and honey was dripping from the ceiling down onto her face, and she laughed that this was a land of milk and honey. Bees had formed a hive in that space between. Now, when I put the arrow on my picture, does that show up for everybody or no? Do you see an arrow moving along the space between?
No.
Okay, so I'll just
No,
skip
you yeah, okay.
that. Okay, so that doesn't work. So next slide. This gives you a view of what the grounds were like and where you might go with your patient for their hour and sit under a tree. I had a patient who chose, when I was away for illness, chose one of these trees as her interim therapist. She also had an actual human interim therapist, but she liked the tree better because it didn't say things that were wrong and it seemed able to listen. So next, this is a map of the grounds. Almost all these buildings are gone, and there's just development built in here. And I don't really think it's necessary to walk you through all that, but it gives you an idea of the size of the campus. Next. This was called Wing B. It had originally been built as a cow barn when the lodge had a working farm that was supplying the food, and the patients could do work in different areas. And that was converted into a doctor's and administrator's office building. David Silver, who was the founder of ISPS-US, had his office there. Next. Okay, so this is Upper Cottage, now torn down. It was the Bullard family's first home. After they moved out of the first floor, the main building, that was the big building I showed earlier, both it and Little Lodge housed adult patients. Little Lodge specializing in borderline condition. Next. Next, Ron. Okay. So this was the ice house that was built for the original Woodlawn Hotel. It served as a music room until its floor and roof rotted out. In my early years at the lodge, and I started there in 1976, I loved to hear a flautist who would be in there practicing Bach. Next. Okay, so this was originally built as a student nurse's residence hall, then became the doctor's office building, although, as I had mentioned, there were doctors who had their offices in other buildings in the hospital. The second window on the long wall, the second window down on the second floor is my office window. And then down in the basement, you can see three little windows in the back. Down there was the conference room, and those are the two pictures on the bottom. This is where we held our Wednesday conferences, which were 2 hours in length and focused on the work with just one patient per week. So the therapist would present for 45 minutes. The administrator, the social worker, the head nurse, and others who were working closely with that patient would all make presentations. We'd have a discussant who would bring in some article, and then there'd be a free-for-all discussion, which, dating back from the FrommReichmann years, was one of those, we're all grown-ups and we're all in some kind of treatment, and so we're assumed to be able to take whatever insults the people in the audience can dish up. They were tough conferences, but very productive. Next. So this was my office. My desk in the lower and the far left, and then a picture of basically a very mellow space and easy to work in, but it's basically a cinder block building. Okay, next. So now we get to Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. The picture in the upper left was probably her passport picture when she arrived in the U.S. at age 45. She died of a heart attack at 67, and that smiling picture was probably within a couple of years of her death. This is in the bottom, this was the Frieda Fromm-Reichmann Cottage. Dexter Senior had it built when she had gone out to Menninger's, and Carl Menninger was trying to woo her away from Chestnut Lodge. Dexter called her and said, "But we've started building a cottage just for you." Now the cottage was just in a straight line from his own office, which had a big bay window, and he had his desk set up so that he could look out that window. So it was very much a kind of fishbowl effect where the boss could keep an eye on her whenever he was at his desk. So the cottage is still standing. They were going to set it up as a museum, but then the Historic Society has ended up renting it out to people. The place always seemed haunted with her spirit, and it was like a shrine. I could feel the force of the shoulds and should nots in her classic book, Principles of Intensive Psychotherapy. And I hope that if you haven't read the book, you'll read it. It has very many excellent pointers on psychodynamic work with patients suffering from psychosis or other severe illnesses. The main point is that the doctor needs to know him or herself in a studied way, looking at resistances, exploring the traumas of the therapist's life, and grappling with his or her defensive style. Because a patient with psychosis will have as their first work trying to ferret out whether that person is trustworthy. And like they uniformly know that challenging the therapist's image of herself is the best way to get a read on that person. So saying, "You seem very nervous. Are you afraid of me?" The therapist comes back with something like, "What makes you think I'm afraid? I'm not aware of feeling afraid of you at all." What sort of, whatever then the comeback questions might be, rather than being able to sit with a patient who's seeing you as nervous, or owning your nervousness. So that, I think, is the main point in her book, that the doctor needs to know her anxieties, and be accepting of the anxieties, understanding their history of development, and being more than willing to be a fellow human with the patient rather than to be some kind of model of excellence in living. So the other big point is that the work of the therapist isn't just to keep attention on what the patient is saying, but to keep closely aware of what the therapist is feeling moment to moment. And if you find yourself then, I don't know, thinking about a murder movie that you saw last weekend, or finding yourself drifting off and not even listening to the patient, but that you've withdrawn into a kind of schizoid state. Maybe you're walking in the woods, whatever it would be. To be aware of that as one unconscious responding to the unconscious of the patient, so that you're cherishing those phases where your mind has wandered, and not assuming that you're losing track of the patient, but rather that you're with the patient in another area of communication. That daydream or whatever could be very relevant to the patient, and once you've got rapport going, that you can share those. I found myself thinking about such and such. Very often the patient will find that uncanny and say, yeah, that goes right along with what I was thinking. I was remembering such and such. It seems like the same kind of memory. So a thing of being fully with the patient as a fellow human. Now, Frieda was only 4 feet 10 inches tall. As you can see from the picture, she was on the overweight side. She wasn't obese, but she was overweight. And she smoked, and she drank a lot of coffee. Joanne Greenberg said that when she came up on the wards, it was a real trip. People treated her with a great deal of dignity. She had helped Kurt Goldstein. He was in charge of a hospital during World War I, and she took over his functions as director of the hospital so that he'd have more time to write his books. I had thought that she'd been a major in the Prussian army, but Gail Hornstein, who did the biography of Fromm-Reichmann, said no, the Army didn't accept women at that time in any case. She ran the hospital for brain-injured soldiers and found that having a fixed schedule, a dependable schedule that stayed pretty much the same one day to the next, worked best for those soldiers. And she recommended that people, when they were seeing their patients, and the therapist saw the patients 4 times a week for 50-minute sessions. Some of the doctors saw the patients even 7 days a week. That you try to keep the patient's session at the same hour of each day as much as you can, so that they develop a rhythm and know when to, know in their bodies when the next hour is going to be, rather than having going to back to check a schedule and that kind of thing. We met with the patients on the unit if they were too disturbed to be able to make the trip over to our offices. Let's see. So she had this experience treating the brain-injured soldiers during the war. Then she worked at I.H. Schultz's Weiße Hirsch, White Deer, which was the only hospital in Germany at that time that was practicing psychodynamics. And it was there that she learned about the writings of Freud. And she said she always knew there was something funny that happens in the relationship between doctor and patient, but she hadn't understood what transference was yet. But she learned it at Weiße Hirsch. She loved giving lectures to the patient groups, and asked to do that rather than the other task that the other doctors had of escorting patients to the opera or to theater. And she had published about 25 papers before coming to the US. So this slide doesn't have a picture of her husband of 4 years, Eric Fromm. He had developed TB and was at Davos in Switzerland for treatment. She came and visited often. She turned up pregnant. It turned out to be an ectopic pregnancy. So she never had any kids, and she really, really wanted kids. She had wanted to be an obstetrician, but she thought that being only 4 feet 10 inches tall, she was too short to be able to deliver babies. And so actually psychiatry had been a second choice for her. And meanwhile, Eric had absolutely not wanted kids because he thought that would interfere with his writing. So for her to turn up pregnant was upsetting to him to the point that the marriage at that point had ended. He came to the United States a year or so later. She went to Alsace-Lorraine and continued working with her patients. Her father, she believed, had suicided, fell down an elevator shaft at the bank where he was being retired because of his growing deafness. He had run a business in Karlsruhe that had failed, and his more wealthy wife with family members that were very active in the Weimar Republic and the national government. That the mother's side of the family found him a job at a bank that was owned by an uncle. And then the father became deaf and couldn't work there anymore. He had 3 daughters, none of them married, was very depressed, and it looked to her like it was like a suicide. As World War II was developing, mother and the 2 younger sisters went to Palestine. Reichman went to Alsace-Lorraine. Eric Fromm was already in New York City, and he called Ernest Hadley, who was Dexter Senior's analyst, and Hadley asked Bullard during a session, are you interested in hiring a German Jewish refugee? And Bullard said no. It was asked again and still no. Finally said, okay, I'll meet her. And he said it was love at first sight, that Frieda had all of the qualifications to help him to actualize his dream of setting up the country's first psychoanalytic hospital specializing in the treatment of psychosis. Again, Gail Hornstein's biography of Frieda is called To Redeem One Person is to Redeem the World. Very good read. Next. So here are some pictures of new buildings that is built in the 1970s or early 80s. There were 4 buildings in a circle. There was the Harry Stack Sullivan, the Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, the Adolf Meyer, and another one. Sullivan, Fromm-Reichmann, William Melanson White, and Adolf Meyer, so the White unit. And so the Sullivan unit was a behavior modification program headed by Bob Heinsohn. Next. Okay, this shows Rose Hill, which was the Bullard family residence. It had been the farmhouse on the farm on which the lodge developed. This is where Sullivan would come out each week and in the recreation room would give a conference. He'd present a patient or somebody there would present. He would be the discussant each week. That was his total, and clinical studies in psychiatry, one of the series of books by him, presents that work that was done in those conferences. Next, Adolescent Unit in the upper left. the Sullivan unit, which had been built as a geriatrics unit on the right, and the adolescent division 4 buildings, kind of like miniature versions of the 4 buildings I just showed you. And that was nicknamed Kitty City, and it opened in 1975. Next. So this is Ernest Bullard, the original medical director. He was the only doctor working there during his lifetime, and he had 1 nurse. He contributed to a 4-volume set that Henry Hurd edited called The Institutional Care of the Insane in the United States and Canada. It described the acute care that was delivered at Mendota and the chronic care at a system of sheltered farms. The percentage of patients who work full-time and part-time is not even approached in our current era. And the same could be said of the psychiatrist's hours of work. Bullard ran the place alone, never took a vacation. He lived on the grounds. He was available around the clock. And in an interesting paradox, the main treatment was rest cure. Next. Okay, so this is Dexter Senior, the second medical director. He was the one who had hired Frieda. So Frieda and he met in 1935, she had run her own sanatorium, which had a kosher kitchen that was jokingly referred to as her Torah Puticum rather than Therapeuticum. She had worked closely with Goldstein, as I mentioned, Georg Grodek, Shandor Ferenczi, and Karen Horney. This picture was taken on Bullard's 70th birthday. His wife, Ann, is seated there talking with Robert Cohen, who lived well into his 90s. He was one of the founders of NIMH and came back to be the director of psychotherapy. He had been analyzed both by Frieda and by Harry Stack Sullivan. Next. So these are a couple of pictures of the lodge staff during what we all call the golden years. Otto Wild, Don Burnham, Harold Searles, Pinckney Powell, Milton Henlick, who was an amazing therapist. The patient could come in grossly psychotic, and on their discharge psychologic testing, there'd be no evidence of psychosis. I'm looking through the slides to see if we're up to 339. Yeah, there we go. So Harold Searles, reading his papers, I think is like spectacular supervision. He's in his writings, his honesty about himself is extraordinary. Things like he was with this male patient and didn't know what he wanted to do more, whether to fuck him or kill him. That's one little quote representative of his style. He very, very honest about what was happening, so that you have an intimate experience of his work, in a way that you can't get from most clinically based papers, where the therapist is describing the patient and saying something in generalities about their countertransference feelings at different points in the treatment. It's like you're in Searles's head when you're reading his stuff, and it's very clear and very scholarly. Those if you love reading from Reichman and Sullivan, Searles should definitely be on that list. So his first book was on the non-human environment in schizophrenia and normality. He makes a big point that psychiatrists in general have focused on the interpersonal and have left out the importance of that known environment, both to patients and to professionals. So that's why the flowering cherry trees, as a tribute to that book. Searles's wife died a couple of years ago at age 94. Searles now is, let's see, 1918. So he's 97 and living with his older son out in California. He retired in his 70s and very firmly and strictly discontinued his psychoanalytic life, not coming and giving presentations places or different places and meetings, not being a discussant or being interviewed, and basically just became a regular aging person. But very warm. My favorite of his papers is the one that got me deciding to work at the lodge, which had to do with unconscious meaning of the pollution crisis, how the pollution, especially in the big cities, especially on the East Coast, was a crisis that people were afraid to acknowledge, and that his paper was, why are analysts avoiding this so important crisis? And that paper was in 1972. My husband had been assigned to a post in Fairbanks, Alaska during the Vietnam War, so it was an extremely lucky assignment. And so we were able to be together, and we had our 4-month-old daughter, and later our middle kid was born up there. And it was totally bucolic, magnificent, and people in the correct proportion with the environment. And then coming back to the East Coast, I was horrified by the brown-green sky. And I kept talking about how the sky's supposed to be blue, and what the hell is happening here. And as Searles said in his paper, if you talk about it, you're reacted to either you're psychotically depressed or paranoid or both. And I had certainly felt that people were shutting down on me if I started complaining about the environment. So when I heard that lecture, it was like I was getting the emergency therapy that I needed. And I decided he'd be my analyst, and that the lodge was a place where I wanted to work, and I began my 45-minute commutes down there every day. Anyhow, that's and the other slides I don't think are that